Dear friends, subscribe and hit the bell. Your support allows us to continue our investigations. At the turn of two epochs of Russian history, a figure emerged in whom all the contradictions of that turning point seemed to refract. Alexander Vasilyevich Kolchak, a name that still evokes a storm of emotions even a century later. A brilliant naval officer and a world-renowned scientist whose polar expeditions expanded the boundaries of human knowledge. And he too was a ruthless dictator whose rule in Siberia was remembered for bloody massacres and economic chaos. A hero to some and an executioner to others, Kolchak became a living symbol of the schism that tore through the heart of Russia. In his fate, as in a drop of water, the tragedy of an entire country was reflected, where talent and duty clashed with the mercilessness of civil war. From the snow-covered expanses of the Arctic to the blood-drenched fields of Siberia, Kolchak's path was as winding as the history of his homeland. A man who discovered new lands and lost his own country. An admiral who became an executioner. A scientist who turned into a symbol of fratricidal war. Such was Alexander Kolchak, a figure without an understanding of whom it is impossible to comprehend the Russian catastrophe of the 20th century. On November 4, 1874, a son, Alexander, was born into the family of hereditary naval officer Vasily Ivanovich Kolchak. The father of the future admiral, a participant in the defense of Sevastopol and a hero of the Crimean War, passed on to his son not only his surname, but also a deep love for the sea, a sense of duty, and devotion to the fatherland. In the Kolchak home, stories of naval battles, distant voyages, and brave navigators were often heard. Little Sasha, holding his breath, listened to his father's tales, imagining himself a captain navigating uncharted waters. The sea element beckoned him from an early age, determining his entire future life path. Alexander's mother, Olga Ilyinichna, came from a family of an Odessa merchant. She surrounded her son with care and instilled in him a love for books and knowledge. In this atmosphere of family values, patriotism, and a thirst for enlightenment, the character of the future polar explorer was formed. In 1888, when Alexander turned 14, he entered the Naval Cadet Corps in St. Petersburg, an elite educational institution that trained officers for the Russian fleet. Here, the young Kolchak showed outstanding abilities in exact sciences, especially in mathematics and physics. Teachers noted his determination, discipline, and inquisitive mind. Classmates respected Alexander for his directness, honesty, and readiness to help. Already in these years, leadership qualities and the ability to take responsibility manifested in him. The years of study at the Corps hardened Kolchak's character, taught him to overcome difficulties and steadfastly endure hardships. The strict daily routine, rigorous discipline, and high demands on cadets formed in him the qualities necessary for a naval officer: endurance, decisiveness, and the ability to make quick decisions in difficult situations. In 1894, Alexander Kolchak graduated from the Naval Corps with honors, receiving the rank of midshipman. He took second place in his graduating class and was awarded the Admiral Ricord Prize. A brilliant career as a naval officer lay before him. But the young midshipman dreamed not just of service in the fleet. He was drawn to scientific research, the unexplored expanses of the Arctic, and the opportunity to make geographical discoveries. This passion for science and research would become an important part of his life before fate took a sharp turn and transformed the scientist into a political leader. Kolchak received his first assignment to the cruiser Rurik, where he began to master the practical foundations of naval service. The command noted his exceptional diligence, attention to detail, and desire for self-improvement. The young officer read a lot, studied foreign languages, and was interested in the latest achievements in oceanography and meteorology. In the spring of 1899, fate presented the young Kolchak with a gift that determined his entire subsequent career. He received an invitation to participate in Baron Edward Toll's polar expedition on the schooner, quote, "For the 25-year-old lieutenant, this was a chance to prove himself not only as a naval officer, but also as a research scientist." Without a moment's hesitation, Kolchak accepted the offer, though he fully understood all the dangers of an Arctic journey. The expedition set itself an ambitious task: to find the legendary Sannikov land, which, according to industrialists, had been seen north of the new Siberian islands. In addition, scientists planned to conduct comprehensive studies of the northern seas, their fauna, flora, and ice conditions. Kolchak was entrusted with hydrological and magnetic observations. Before departure, he underwent special training at the main physical observatory, where he mastered methods of scientific measurement. On June 21, 1900, the schooner Zarya departed from Kronstadt and set course north. The most romantic period in Alexander Kolchak's life began. The harsh conditions of the Arctic demanded courage, endurance, and iron discipline from the expedition members. Temperatures reached 50 degrees below zero, the polar night lasted for months, and the constant threat of ice compression kept the crew on edge. But it was here, amidst the boundless ice, that Kolchak discovered new qualities within himself: the patience of a scientist, the passion of an explorer, and the ability to maintain composure in critical situations. During the wintering off the coast of the Taimyr Peninsula, Kolchak made multi-kilometer treks across the ice to conduct measurements. He collected samples of seawater from different depths, studied currents and salinity, and carried out magnetic observations. His scientific diary was filled with invaluable data, which later formed the basis of serious research on the hydrology of the northern seas. Kolchak was particularly fascinated by the problem of polar ice. He spent hours observing its movement, structure, and the processes of its formation and melting. These observations later allowed him to develop an original theory of Arctic ice formation, which brought him recognition in scientific circles. The expedition lasted for more than 2 years and became a true school of survival. The team endured 2 winterings in the ice, faced food shortages, scurvy, and other trials. In these conditions, Kolchak's best qualities shone through. He never lost his presence of mind, supported his comrades, and continued his scientific work even in the most difficult circumstances. His indefatigability and enthusiasm earned the respect even of seasoned polar explorers. Baron Toll highly valued the young officer's abilities. In his diaries, he repeatedly noted Kolchak's scientific meticulousness, his bravery, and his readiness for self-sacrifice. A relationship developed between them not merely of superior and subordinate, but of teacher and student, united by a common passion for exploring the unknown. The Arctic expanses became for Alexander Kolchak not just a field of scientific activity, but a true calling. After the first expedition returned, Baron Toll decided to continue the search for Sannikov land, and in May 1902, he set off with a small group of researchers on a risky journey across the drifting ice. He planned to reach Bennett Island and return to the mainland before winter, but the expedition disappeared without a trace among the boundless ice fields. When it became clear that Toll and his companions were lost, Kolchak, without hesitation, volunteered to organize a rescue operation. This decision demonstrated not only his devotion to science, but also his highest human qualities: loyalty to comrades and a readiness to risk his own life for others. In the spring of 1903, Kolchak led an unprecedentedly bold expedition on a whaleboat, a small boat only 8 meters long. With a team of 7 men, he set off across the Arctic Ocean to Bennett Island, one of the most inaccessible places in the Arctic. The journey proved to be a true test of courage. The fragile vessel made its way between huge ice floes, risking being crushed every minute. The polar explorers endured cold, hunger, and exhausting treks across the ice when they had to drag the boat by hand. But Kolchak showed exceptional leadership qualities. He maintained the team's morale, was the first to tackle the hardest work, inspiring others by his example. Upon reaching Bennett Island, the expedition discovered traces of Toll's group, a carefully hidden collection of geological samples, and a note indicating that the Baron and his companions had left the island, trying to reach the mainland across the ice. This was the last message from them. Kolchak organized thorough searches but failed to find the missing men. Nevertheless, the expedition yielded invaluable scientific results. Kolchak compiled detailed maps of previously unexplored territories, collected unique meteorological data, and conducted hydrological measurements in unexplored areas of the Arctic Ocean. Of particular value were his observations of polar ice, which formed the basis of his fundamental work, The Ice of the Kara and Siberian Seas. This work, published in 1909, became a real breakthrough in understanding the nature of Arctic ice and brought Kolchak worldwide fame as a scientist. For his polar research, Kolchak was awarded the highest award of the Russian Geographical Society, the Grand Konstantinovsky Medal. This was an exceptional recognition of the young researcher's merits, as previously only the most outstanding travelers and scientists had been honored in this way. His name was immortalized on maps. One of the islands in the Kara Sea was named Kolchak Island. Alexander Vasilyevich's scientific works received recognition not only in Russia, but also abroad. He was invited to speak at leading geographical societies in Europe. His works were cited and translated. In world science, Kolchak took his place among such outstanding polar explorers as Nansen and Amundsen. The Arctic expeditions shaped Kolchak not only as a scientist, but also as a person. In the harsh conditions of the North, his character was forged, and qualities developed that would later manifest in his military and political activities. Decisiveness, the ability to act in extreme situations, the capacity to take responsibility, and to lead people. Polar research remained the brightest pages in Kolchak's biography. It was here, among the ice and snow, that his multifaceted talent as a scientist, sailor, and leader was revealed. However, history prepared a completely different fate for him. The beginning of the 20th century brought Russia not only revolutionary upheavals, but also military trials. In January 1904, without a declaration of war, the Japanese fleet attacked the Russian squadron in Port Arthur, initiating the Russo-Japanese War. For Lieutenant Kolchak, this became a turning point. From a polar explorer-scientist, he was destined to become a combat officer. Upon receiving news of the war's outbreak, Alexander Vasilyevich immediately submitted a report requesting a transfer to the Pacific Fleet. His request was granted, and soon he arrived in the besieged fortress of Port Arthur, where he was appointed commander of the destroyer Angry. Here, his military talent and fearlessness fully manifested themselves. Port Arthur, gripped by the Japanese blockade, represented Russia's forward defense line in the Far East. Superior enemy forces methodically destroyed the Russian fleet trapped in the harbor. In these conditions, Kolchak developed an innovative tactic of mine warfare, which allowed small forces to inflict tangible damage on the enemy. Night sorties on mine boats under heavy enemy fire became his signature move. Under the cover of darkness, small vessels would slip out of the harbor and lay mines on the approaches to Port Arthur. This dangerous work required exceptional precision, composure, and knowledge of hydrography, qualities honed by Kolchak in polar expeditions. Once, during such an operation, Kolchak's boat was detected by Japanese searchlights. Under hurricane fire, when it seemed impossible to escape, he displayed astonishing self-possession. Maneuvering between shell explosions, Kolchak not only managed to lay mines, but also safely returned to the harbor. For this operation, he was awarded the Golden Weapon with the inscription. Another time, when the Japanese sank the squadron's flagship, Petropavlovsk, Kolchak rushed to save drowning sailors, risking his own life. This act strengthened his authority among the sailors, who saw in him an officer for whom the lives of his subordinates were more precious than his own safety. In November 1904, during an artillery duel with a Japanese battery, Kolchak was severely wounded by a shell fragment. Despite the injury, he refused to leave his post, continuing to direct fire. Only after losing consciousness from blood loss was he evacuated to the hospital. When the fortress fell, the wounded Kolchak found himself in Japanese captivity. He used this time to study the Japanese language and the enemy's military art. Observing the organization of the Japanese army, he drew conclusions about the reasons for Russia's defeat and the necessary reforms in the military sphere. Returning from captivity in 1905, Kolchak brought with him not only combat awards, but also invaluable experience of modern warfare. The Russo-Japanese campaign became for him a school of combat command, determining his future career as a military leader. Here, in the waters of the Yellow Sea, the character of the future admiral, resolute, fearless, and ready to go to the end, was finally formed. Upon his return from Japanese captivity, Alexander Kolchak found himself at the center of extensive work to restore the Russian fleet. The defeat in the war with Japan exposed all the shortcomings of the empire's naval forces: outdated ships, an archaic management system, and a lack of long-term development strategy. The country needed a new fleet, and Kolchak, with his combat experience and scientific thinking, became one of the key participants in this process. In 1906, Kolchak joined the Commission for Fleet Reform at the Naval General Staff. Here, his talent as a strategist and analyst became apparent. He insisted on a comprehensive approach. It was not enough simply to build new ships. The entire system needed to be changed, from officer training to the organization of coastal defense. One of Kolchak's main achievements was the development of the Small Fleet Program. Understanding that Russia could not quickly restore the lost battleships, he proposed focusing on the construction of destroyers, submarines, and cruisers, mobile and relatively inexpensive ships capable of effectively defending coastal waters and launching unexpected attacks on the enemy. In the official notes of that period, Kolchak wrote, "The fleet must correspond to the country's geographical position and economic capabilities. We do not need a pursuit of heavy ships in terms of quantity, but the creation of balanced naval forces where each ship has its place in the overall strategy." His ideas found support in the highest circles. Kolchak quickly advanced through the ranks, captain second rank, captain first rank, and in 1913, at the age of 39, he received the rank of Rear Admiral, becoming the youngest admiral of the Russian fleet. Parallel to his administrative work, Kolchak did not abandon scientific activity. He systematized the materials of his polar expeditions, lectured at the Naval Academy, and published articles on the hydrography of the northern seas. His authority in scientific circles was so high that even recognized luminaries of oceanography listened to his opinion. Kolchak paid special attention to officer training. At his initiative, new disciplines were included in the curriculum of the Naval Corps: radio engineering, electromechanics, and the basics of aviation. "The future of the fleet," he said, "belongs to officers who master the latest technologies, are capable of strategic thinking, and act independently." In 1912, Kolchak headed a special commission to study the experience of using naval aviation. He was one of the first in Russia to realize the potential of aircraft for reconnaissance and artillery fire correction. At his insistence, the first aviation group was created in the Baltic Fleet, marking the beginning of Russian naval aviation. Kolchak's reform activities also met with resistance. The conservative part of the Admiralty considered his ideas too radical and his methods too assertive. But the results spoke for themselves. By the beginning of the First World War, the Russian fleet had significantly strengthened, replenished with modern ships and trained crews. When war broke out in August 1914, Kolchak met it fully prepared. He was appointed commander of the Mine Division of the Baltic Fleet, a unit that was to play a key role in defending the sea approaches to the empire's capital. In July 1916, Alexander Kolchak's destiny took a new turn. He was appointed commander of the Black Sea Fleet with the rank of vice admiral. At 42 years old, he became the youngest fleet commander of such rank in Russian history. Taking command, Kolchak delivered a brief but memorable speech. These words became the program of his activity in his new position. Upon assuming office, the admiral immediately began reorganizing the fleet. Instead of passive port defense, he moved to active operations aimed at complete domination of the Black Sea waters. Kolchak personally developed a system of minefields off the coast of Turkey, creating a veritable, quote, "one" on the approaches to the Bosphorus. The innovative tactics yielded quick results. The Turkish fleet was virtually trapped in its bases. In the first months of Kolchak's command, dozens of enemy ships, including several large transports with military cargo, were blown up and sunk by mines. The operation to mine the Zonguldak coal region was particularly successful, depriving the Turkish fleet of its most important fuel source. The admiral did not limit himself to desk work. He regularly went to sea on destroyers, personally leading the riskiest operations. Officers recalled how Kolchak, standing on the bridge under fire from shore batteries, calmly gave orders as if he were on exercises. His personal bravery inspired the crews and created a special fighting spirit in the fleet. Technical innovations were another strong point of Kolchak's command. He was the first in the Black Sea Fleet to widely use naval aviation for reconnaissance and artillery fire correction. At his initiative, special aircraft-carrying ships were created, capable of delivering aircraft to enemy shores. This tactic allowed for unexpected strikes on Turkish ports and communications. The famous raid on Zonguldak in February 1917 became a model of coordinated fleet and air operations. Kolchak's ships shelled the port, while seaplanes, launched from aircraft carriers, bombed railway stations and warehouses. The Turks suffered heavy losses, and the Russian fleet lost not a single ship. The successes of the Black Sea Fleet under Kolchak's command did not go unnoticed. His name became known far beyond naval circles. Newspapers wrote about the terror of the Turkish fleet, the Russian Nelson, comparing him to Admiral Nakhimov. But Kolchak himself remained modest and focused on fulfilling his duty. When he was offered to write memoirs about his victories, he replied, "It's not time for memoirs yet. First, we need to win the war." The February Revolution of 1917 crashed down upon Russia like a storm on a rudderless ship. For Admiral Kolchak, at the peak of his military career. These events marked the beginning of a dramatic turn of fate. News of the monarchy's fall reached him on his flagship in Sevastopol. As a man of duty, he recognized the authority of the provisional government and sent a telegram to Petrograd pledging support for the new power. However, internally, Kolchak grieved deeply over the collapse of the empire to which he had sworn allegiance. In his diary, he wrote, "Revolutionary unrest quickly reached the Black Sea Fleet. Heated discussions raged in wardrooms and sailors' quarters, committees were formed, and radical slogans were voiced. Kolchak tried to maintain discipline and the combat readiness of the fleet. He personally addressed the sailors, convincing them of the need to continue the war until victory." The admiral even took an unprecedented step. He recognized the right of sailors' committees to participate in resolving economic issues, but categorically refused to allow their interference in operational command. Initially, his authority and personal charisma helped to contain the revolutionary fervor. The Black Sea Fleet remained the most disciplined formation of the Russian armed forces in the spring of 1917. However, with each passing day, the situation worsened. Agitators from Petrograd and Kronstadt, where the revolutionary fire was already raging, arrived in Sevastopol and incited the sailors to disobedience. The culmination came in June. At a general meeting of the crew of the battleship, "1", a decision was made to disarm the officers. Upon learning of this, Kolchak arrived at the ship and addressed the sailors with an angry speech. He reminded them of their oath, of their duty to the fatherland, of the enemy at the gates. And then he did something that shocked everyone present. He unbuckled his ceremonial saber, inscribed "2" from his belt, and threw it overboard. He declared. This dramatic gesture did not save the situation. A few days later, Kolchak received a telegram from Naval Minister Kerensky demanding his immediate arrival in Petrograd. Upon his arrival in the capital, the admiral was effectively removed from command of the fleet. The formal pretext was "4", but the real reason was the provisional government's distrust of a monarchist-leaning officer. Finding himself out of work, Kolchak accepted an unexpected offer from the American government. The United States, having just entered the war, was interested in the Russian admiral's experience in combating submarines and mine warfare. In July 1917, Kolchak set off for the USA at the head of a naval mission. The trip to America became for him not only a professional assignment, but also an opportunity to comprehend what was happening in Russia. While away from his homeland, he anxiously followed reports of growing chaos and the disintegration of the army. When news of the Bolshevik coup arrived in October, Kolchak perceived it as a national catastrophe. "5", he told his American colleagues. From the USA, Kolchak traveled to Great Britain, where he met with Admiral Jellicoe and other high-ranking officers of the British fleet. Plans for joint actions against Germany were discussed, but now without the participation of Russia, which had withdrawn from the war. During these months, a turning point occurred in Kolchak's consciousness. From a military professional, far removed from politics, he was transformed into a political figure ready to fight for the revival of Russia. His statements increasingly voiced the idea of the need to overthrow the Bolshevik regime by force of arms. Kolchak made the decision to return to his homeland and join the fight against the Bolsheviks at the beginning of 1918. His path lay through the Far East, where the first centers of anti-Bolshevik resistance were already forming. In the autumn of 1918, Alexander Kolchak arrived in Vladivostok. The Far East at that time was a whimsical mosaic of warring forces: Japanese and American interventionists, the Czechoslovak Corps, Cossack formations of Ataman Semyonov, scattered White Guard detachments. Russia was disintegrating before his eyes, and Kolchak, accustomed to a clear hierarchy of military command, bitterly observed this chaos. Initially, the admiral planned to reach General Denikin's volunteer army in southern Russia, but fate decreed otherwise. In Omsk, which had become the center of anti-Bolshevik forces in Siberia, a government was being formed that required experienced military specialists. Kolchak was offered the post of Minister of War and Navy in the Directory, a provisional all-Russian government created at the Ufa State Conference. After some hesitation, the admiral accepted the offer and arrived in Omsk in October. The Siberian capital greeted him with biting cold and an atmosphere of intrigue. The Directory, consisting of 5 people with different political views, was initially an unviable organism. Socialist revolutionaries and liberals, monarchists and Democrats engaged in endless disputes about Russia's path of development, while the Bolsheviks strengthened their power. Kolchak, alien to politicking, focused on creating a combat-ready army. His energy, organizational talent, and military experience quickly brought the admiral to the forefront among Omsk politicians. Officers, industrialists, and financiers, disillusioned with the Directory's inaction, began to gather around him. On the evening of November 18, 1918, a coup d'état occurred in Omsk. Cossack units under the command of Colonel Volkov arrested members of the Directory from among the socialist revolutionaries. Kolchak subsequently claimed that he was not the initiator of the coup, but events unfolded with his tacit consent. Early on the morning of November 19th, the Council of Ministers gathered for an emergency meeting. After heated debates, it was decided to transfer all power to one person capable of restoring order with an iron hand. The choice fell on Kolchak, a man with an impeccable reputation and enormous authority. The admiral was proclaimed Supreme Ruler of Russia with dictatorial powers. Accepting power, Kolchak delivered a brief speech. "I will not follow the path of reaction, nor the ruinous path of partisanship. My sole goal will be the creation of a combat-ready army, victory over Bolshevism, and the establishment of law and order." On the same day, he conferred upon himself the rank of Admiral of the Russian Fleet. News of the coup in Omsk spread like lightning throughout Siberia and the Far East. Most anti-Bolshevik forces recognized Kolchak's authority. Ataman Semyonov in the Far East, General Dutov in the Urals, the government of the northern region, all of them formally submitted to the supreme ruler. Even General Denikin in southern Russia recognized the supremacy of the Omsk government on an all-Russian scale. It seemed that the disparate forces of the White Movement had finally found a single center. Kolchak immediately began to reorganize the army and the state apparatus. He abolished all democratic institutions introduced by the Directory, established strict censorship, and military field courts to combat the Bolshevik underground. At the same time, the admiral tried to enlist the support of the Allies, Great Britain, France, the USA, and Japan, whose troops were on the territory of Siberia and the Far East. The coup of November 18th became a turning point in the Civil War. The White Movement gained a leader of world renown, and the Bolsheviks acquired a serious adversary capable of uniting disparate anti-Soviet forces. The polar explorer, a world-renowned scientist, a combat admiral, now became a political leader who assumed the burden of power at the most tragic moment in Russian history. Kolchak's ascent to power marked a new stage in the history of the White Movement. Having become the supreme ruler, the admiral immediately began forming a government. He appointed experienced administrators to key positions, predominantly Tsarist officials and liberal politicians. Pyotr Volогодsky became prime minister, Ivan Sukin, minister of foreign affairs, and Ivan Mikhailov was in charge of finance. Kolchak paid special attention to the military department, which he effectively headed himself, though General Stepanov was formally the minister. The ideological program of Kolchak's government rested on three pillars: the fight against Bolshevism until its complete destruction, the restoration of a united and indivisible Russia, and the convocation of a national assembly after victory to determine the future state structure. Kolchak deliberately avoided monarchist slogans, understanding their unpopularity among broad segments of the population. Instead, he emphasized patriotic rhetoric and promises to restore order. "I am neither a reactionary nor a revolutionary," declared the supreme ruler in his addresses. "I am merely a soldier fulfilling his duty to the fatherland." This position allowed him to balance between various political forces, from moderate socialists to staunch monarchists. The administrative system of the Kolchak regime was characterized by rigid centralization. All power was concentrated in the hands of the supreme ruler, who could make any decisions unilaterally. Locally, governance was carried out by governors and district chiefs appointed from the center. Zemstva and city dumas were retained, but their powers were significantly limited. A widespread counterintelligence system, headed by Colonel Zlobin, was created to combat the Bolshevik underground. Diplomacy became the most important direction of Kolchak's government activity. The admiral perfectly understood that without the support of the Entente countries, it would be impossible to defeat the Bolsheviks. He sent his representatives to Paris, London, and Washington, seeking official recognition of his government and increased military supplies. Relations with the Allies were difficult. Great Britain, led by Winston Churchill, most consistently supported Kolchak, supplying his army with weapons and equipment. France showed reserved interest, limiting itself to diplomatic support. The United States, under President Wilson, adopted a wait-and-see attitude, not officially recognizing the Omsk government, but also not denying it material assistance. Japan played a special role, its troops controlling a significant part of the Far East. Tokyo pursued its own interests, supporting the separatist sentiments of Ataman Semyonov and other local leaders, which created serious problems for Kolchak. In May of 19, the supreme ruler sent the quote, 3, named after the Minister of Foreign Affairs, to the Allies, outlining his political program. Kolchak promised to convene a constituent assembly after victory, implement democratic reforms, and respect the rights of national minorities. In response, the Allies sent a note to the admiral, effectively recognizing him as the de facto head of the Russian state, but conditioned full recognition on the fulfillment of democratic promises. This diplomatic success coincided with military victories of Kolchak's armies on the Eastern Front, creating the illusion of an imminent triumph. It seemed that, in a little while, the white troops would enter Moscow, putting an end to the Bolshevik experiment. However, history decreed otherwise. The spring offensive of 1919 became the finest hour of Kolchak's army. In March, the white forces advanced westward on a broad front from Perm to Orenburg. The offensive developed rapidly. Within a few weeks, Ufa, Birsk, and Sarapul were liberated. It seemed that just a little more, and white banners would wave over Kazan, from where there was a direct road to Moscow. Euphoria reigned at Kolchak's headquarters. Officers were already planning a parade on Red Square. The supreme ruler himself rarely appeared at his residence during these days, constantly traveling to the front where he inspired the troops with fiery speeches. "One more effort, gentlemen," he would say, and Russia will be saved from the Bolshevik plague. Successes at the front were reinforced by diplomatic victories. The Allies increased supplies of weapons and equipment, and military missions from Western powers arrived in Omsk. British General Knox, head of the British military mission, reported to London, "Kolchak is close to a decisive victory." However, the May counteroffensive of the Red Army shattered these hopes. The Bolsheviks concentrated their best forces on the Eastern Front under the command of talented generals, Frunze, Tukhachevsky, Kamenev. They delivered a powerful blow to the stretched communications of the White Armies. The strategic miscalculations of Kolchak's command became evident. The offensive was conducted without sufficient reserves, flanks were unprotected, and the rear was vulnerable to partisan detachments. By the end of May, the initiative had completely passed to the Reds. The White Armies rolled back eastward, abandoning cities that had recently greeted them with jubilation as liberators. In June, Ufa fell, then Perm. By August, the Reds reached the Ural Mountains, a natural boundary that Kolchak hoped to hold. But these hopes also proved futile. The Red Army, having gained momentum, easily overcame the mountain range and entered the Siberian expanses. The retreat turned into a flight. Kolchak rushed between headquarters, trying to stop the collapse of the front. He dismissed negligent generals, formed new units from the last reserves, and appealed to the Allies for help. But it was too late. The strategic initiative was irretrievably lost. The reasons for the military catastrophe lay not only in tactical errors, but also in fundamental problems of the Kolchak regime. The White Army, consisting mainly of officers and Cossacks, was alienated from the people. Peasants, who constituted the majority of the Siberian population, initially welcomed the Whites as saviors from Bolshevik food requisition detachments. But brutal requisitions, mobilizations, and punitive expeditions quickly alienated the rural population. Rebellions flared up in the rear of Kolchak's armies, and partisan detachments operated, disrupting front supplies. Another problem was Kolchak's allies. The Czechoslovak Corps, which controlled the Trans-Siberian Railway, had lost its morale by the summer of 1919. The Czechs, tired of the Russian Civil War, desired only one thing: to return home. They refused to participate in combat operations and at times even hindered the movement of White troops by rail. The Japanese in the Far East pursued their own interests, supporting separatists like Ataman Semenov. The British and Americans, who promised significant aid, in reality limited themselves to supplying outdated weapons and equipment. By the autumn of 1919, the military situation of the Kolchak regime became critical. Red troops were approaching Omsk, the capital of White Siberia. Government institutions hastily evacuated eastward, and panic reigned in the city. On November 14th, as units of the Red Army were already entering the suburbs, Kolchak left Omsk. His train set off along the Trans-Siberian Railway eastward, on a hopeless journey that would end in tragedy in Irkutsk. The underside of the Supreme Ruler's power is revealed to us in all its grim reality when we turn to the policy of mass terror that unfolded in the rear of Kolchak's armies. Behind the ceremonial facade of restoring order lay a system of repression directed not only against the Bolsheviks, but also against the civilian population suspected of sympathy for Soviet power. Already in the winter of 1918, punitive detachments appeared in Siberian cities and villages, operating under the slogan, "No mercy for the enemies of Russia." Atamans Semyonov, Kalmykov, and Annenkov gained particularly sad notoriety, their detachments terrorizing the local population. Kolchak himself, while in Omsk, may not have given direct orders for reprisals, but his policy of restoring order at any cost untied the hands of local warlords. The mechanism of repression was meticulously fine-tuned. Counterintelligence identified unreliable elements. Military field courts passed sentences, and special teams carried out executions. Often the procedure was simplified to the extreme. People were arrested on denunciation and sent to prisons or executed without trial. Peasant uprisings were suppressed with particular cruelty. After suppressing a rebellion, punitive forces burned entire villages, shot every 10th man, and subjected women and old people to executions. Such methods only generated hatred and new uprisings. Thousands of prisoners were held in Omsk prisons, from Bolshevik commissars to ordinary peasants who refused to surrender grain or pay taxes. The conditions of detention were horrific: overcrowded cells, lack of medical care, and abuse by guards. Many did not live to see a trial, dying from disease and exhaustion. The scale of victims of Kolchak's terror is difficult to accurately determine. According to various estimates, tens of thousands of people died at the hands of punitive forces. In the Yekaterinburg Governorate alone, over 25,000 people were executed in a few months. In Omsk, the count ran into thousands. In Krasnoyarsk, after the suppression of a workers' uprising, over 700 people were shot in one night. The peasantry suffered particularly, caught between the hammer and anvil of the civil war. Kolchak's authorities demanded grain, horses, and recruits. Refusal was equated to treason. In response to requisitions and mobilizations, peasants took up arms. Uprisings flared up one after another in Slavgorod, Minusинsk, Kustanai. By the summer of 1919, a significant part of the Siberian rear was engulfed in a partisan movement. Mamontov's famous army in Altai numbered up to 18,000 fighters. In the Yenisei Governorate, the army of Kravchenko and Shetinkin operated. In the Irkutsk region, the detachments of Kalandarishvili. These people's armies inflicted serious damage on Kolchak's rear, cutting communications and destroying garrisons. The policy of terror had catastrophic consequences for Kolchak's regime. It alienated the middle strata of the population, the intelligentsia, petty bourgeoisie, prosperous peasantry, who had initially welcomed the overthrow of the Bolsheviks. Even allies were shocked by the scale of the repressions. British General Knox reported to London, "Kolchak's authorities, by their actions, are themselves breeding Bolsheviks." American General Graves wrote in his memoirs, "I saw so many instances of summary executions that I came to the conclusion, the Bolshevik regime cannot be worse than this." By the end of 1919, the popularity of Kolchak's regime among the population had fallen to a critical level. Even those who hated the Bolsheviks did not wish to defend a government stained with the blood of peaceful citizens. When the Red Army entered Siberia, many greeted it as a liberator from Kolchak's terror. Thus, the policy of mass repressions, intended to strengthen the regime of the Supreme Ruler, in fact became one of the main reasons for its collapse. Among all the dramatic events associated with the rule of Admiral Kolchak, the history of the Russian Empire's gold reserve occupies a special place. This treasure, which became a bargaining chip in a political game, traveled a long way from imperial vaults to Siberian hideouts, leaving behind a trail of mysteries and unresolved questions. In the summer of 1918, as the Bolsheviks consolidated their power in central Russia, the empire's gold reserve was evacuated from Kazan to Siberia. It was truly a king's trophy, 513 tons of gold in ingots and coins, with a total value of over 650 million gold rubles. 40 railway cars were required to transport this wealth, carefully guarded by units of the Czechoslovak Corps. By today's standards, the value of this gold would exceed $13 billion, a fortune capable of changing the course of a war. After the coup on November 18th, the gold reserve came into Kolchak's possession, becoming the financial foundation of his regime. The Supreme Ruler understood the value of this resource and initially managed it quite rationally. Part of the gold was deposited in foreign banks as collateral for war loans and payment for arms supplies. The Allies, especially Great Britain and France, readily accepted Russian gold in exchange for rifles, ammunition, uniforms, and medicines. Japan received a significant share of the reserve in exchange for a promise of military assistance, which was never fully fulfilled. American banks also participated in these operations, although the U.S. government officially distanced itself from supporting Kolchak. However, as the military situation of the White Army deteriorated, control over the expenditure of gold became increasingly chaotic. Various Ottomans, ministers, and quartermasters gained access to the treasure, often without proper accounting and reporting. There are known cases where boxes of gold coins simply disappeared en route to their destination. The fate of the part of the reserve that was sent to Vladivostok to pay for Japanese supplies remains particularly vague. According to some reports, a significant portion of this gold never reached its intended recipient, settling in the pockets of intermediaries or falling into the hands of local rulers of the Far East. During the retreat of Kolchak's troops in the autumn of 1919, the gold reserve was evacuated from Omsk along with government institutions. The train with the gold moved east along the Trans-Siberian Railway, constantly exposed to the danger of attacks by Red partisans or rebellious Czechoslovaks. In this confusion, part of the valuable cargo disappeared without a trace. When an uprising against Kolchak's regime occurred in Irkutsk in January 1920, the remnants of the gold reserve were seized by the rebels and subsequently transferred to the Soviet government. However, by the most conservative estimates, the Bolsheviks received no more than 2/3 of the original volume. The fate of the remaining gold gave rise to many legends and theories. Some claimed that Kolchak managed to secretly smuggle part of the treasures to Harbin and Shanghai, where they were placed in banks under fictitious names. Others spoke of secret burials in the Siberian taiga, where boxes of gold await their new owners. Still others pointed to accounts in Swiss banks opened by the admiral's inner circle. These legends gave rise to an entire industry of treasure hunting. For decades after the Civil War, various expeditions scoured the areas of the Trans-Siberian Railway in search of Kolchak's hidden gold. To this day, historians debate how much gold was lost or stolen and who is responsible for this loss. Some accuse Kolchak himself of squandering national wealth, others point to the Allies, particularly the Japanese, and still others blame atamans and generals who acted in their own interests. The collapse of Kolchak regime began rapidly. In November 1919, when the Red Army approached Omsk, the Supreme Ruler, with the remnants of his government and the gold reserve, was forced to evacuate eastward. His train moved slowly along the Trans-Siberian Railway, stopping at every major station. Kolchak still hoped to halt the Red offensive somewhere in Transbaikalia, regroup his forces and resume the offensive. But fate had a different ending in store for him. Control over the railway at that time was exercised by units of the Czechoslovak Corps, former prisoners of war of the Austro-Hungarian army formed in Russia to fight against Germany. After the end of the World War, the Czechs desired only one thing: to return home. They were tired of the Russian turmoil and no longer wished to shed blood for foreign interests. In December, the commander of the Czechoslovak troops, General Sirovi, effectively presented Kolchak with an ultimatum: The admiral must transfer control of the railway to Allied representatives, otherwise his train would not be allowed to proceed further east. The Supreme Ruler was forced to agree, finding himself a hostage of those whom he had recently considered allies. On December 15th, in Nizhneudinsk, Kolchak's train was stopped by the Czechs. The admiral was effectively placed under house arrest. At this time, an uprising against Kolchak's authority broke out in Irkutsk. It was led by the so-called Political Center, a coalition of socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks, who sought to create a buffer state between Soviet Russia and the Far East. The Czechoslovak command, wishing to secure their path eastward, entered into negotiations with the Political Center. The result was a treacherous agreement. The Czechs pledged to hand over Kolchak and the gold reserve in exchange for unhindered passage to Vladivostok. On January 15, 1920, the admiral was handed over to representatives of the Political Center in Irkutsk. In his last order, Kolchak transferred supreme authority to General Denikin and command of the troops in Siberia to Ataman Semenov. This gesture had only symbolic significance. The admiral no longer possessed real power. In Irkutsk, Kolchak was imprisoned and an investigation began. The Extraordinary Investigative Commission interrogated him daily. The protocols of these interrogations have been preserved and represent a unique historical document. The admiral maintained his dignity, answered questions clearly and in detail, without attempting to shirk responsibility for the actions of his government. He stated, "I do not admit guilt for the crimes leveled against me. I served my motherland as I understood this duty." At the same time, Kolchak did not deny that cruelties and lawlessness occurred under his rule, but asserted that they were committed against his will. On January 21st, power in Irkutsk passed to the Bolshevik Military Revolutionary Committee. Kolchak's fate was sealed. A telegram arrived from Moscow, signed by Lenin. In the early morning of February 7, 1920, Kolchak and his Prime Minister Pepelyev were led out of prison. On the bank of the Ushakovka River, a tributary of the Angara, in the pre-dawn gloom, shots rang out. The bodies of the executed were thrown into a hole in the ice. Thus ended the life of a man who dreamed of reviving a great Russia, but became one of the most tragic figures in its history. Kolchak's death marked the symbolic end of organized resistance to the Bolsheviks in Siberia. The White Movement lost its leader, recognized by all anti-Bolshevik forces. The remaining generals and atamans acted in disarray, pursuing their own interests. For many officers and civilians who had tied their fate to the White cause, the admiral's death became a signal for emigration. Thousands of people flocked to Vladivostok to leave by sea for China, Japan, America. The Great Russian Emigration began, the exodus of an entire stratum of educated people who did not accept Bolshevik rule. A century after the tragic events of the Civil War, the figure of Alexander Kolchak remains one of the most controversial in Russian history. Polar explorer, talented naval commander, and dictator of Siberia, his legacy still sparks fierce debates among historians, politicians, and ordinary citizens. In the Soviet era, Kolchak's image was unequivocally demonized. In school textbooks, fiction, and films, he was portrayed exclusively as a cruel tyrant and a puppet of foreign powers. The admiral's very name became a byword for white terror and counter-revolution. Official historiography presented Kolchak solely as an executioner of the working people, without the slightest mention of his scientific achievements and military merits. With the fall of Soviet power, a gradual re-evaluation of the Supreme Ruler's personality began. Archives opened, and new research emerged based on previously inaccessible documents. historians began to speak of Kolchak as a multifaceted historical figure, combining outstanding virtues and tragic misconceptions. In the 1990s, the pendulum of public opinion swung in the opposite direction. Works idealizing Kolchak appeared, presenting him exclusively as a hero and a martyr. A memorial cross was erected in Irkutsk at the site of the admiral's execution, and in 2000, a memorial plaque was placed in St. Petersburg. The feature film Admiral gained particular fame, creating a romanticized image of Kolchak as a noble hero and an unfortunate lover. However, the scientific community called for a more balanced approach. Modern researchers acknowledge both Kolchak's undeniable merits in polar exploration and his military talents, as well as his responsibility for repression and economic chaos in the regions under his control. Attempts at Kolchak's legal rehabilitation sparked sharp controversy in society. In 2000, the Military Collegium of the Supreme Court of Russia denied his rehabilitation, recognizing the charge of organizing mass repressions as justified. This decision was upheld in 2007, despite numerous appeals from public organizations. The admiral's image has firmly entered the cultural space of modern Russia. In addition to the aforementioned film, Kolchak has become the hero of dozens of books, plays, and musical works. A museum dedicated to his life and activities operates in Irkutsk. Streets named after Kolchak have appeared in several Russian cities, although each such decision was accompanied by public discussions. The figure of Kolchak is today perceived as a symbol of the national tragedy of the Civil War, when millions of Russians found themselves on opposite sides of the barricades. His fate reminds us of how thin the line is between heroism and crime in an era of historical cataclysms. Perhaps the main lesson from Kolchak's history is the understanding that even the noblest goals do not justify cruel means to achieve them. A talented scientist and patriot of his country, he was drawn into the maelstrom of a fratricidal war, where moral guidelines blur and human life is devalued. Today, a century after those tragic events, Kolchak's legacy calls us to national reconciliation, to the realization that in a civil war, there can be no absolute heroes and absolute villains. This is a reminder that the most terrible war is a war of compatriots against each other, and that the true greatness of a nation lies in its ability to learn lessons from the darkest pages of its history.